Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Our guests are Pat Loeb from KYW-AM, Katie Meyer from Spotlight, PA, and Harrison Cann from City and State, PA. Harrison, we'll start with you. Donald Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016, lost it in 2020, and got it back in 2024. How did he do it?
Largely similar in not just Pennsylvania, but all the other swing states. He relied on the Latino vote in part, and also he just improved his margins along a bunch of different groups. And if you look at the bellwether counties in Pennsylvania, like Bucks and Lackawanna and Northampton, Trump either improved on his 2020 margins, or Harris just wasn't able to, garner enough support from that coalition of voters that Biden relied on 4 years ago. So, the combination of lower turnout and a little shift in demographics went Trump's way.
Oh, expand on what you said about lower turnout, Harrison. Just how did turnout look overall? It sounds like in your eyes it didn't meet expectations.
Yeah, well, early on, especially in Philadelphia, where I'm based, Mayor Parker and some of the Democratic officials were touting some very high turnout numbers. I know there were a lot of long lines in some places. So we did expect some high turnout, but based on 2020 numbers, it seems like it's going to come up a little bit short, but I know the numbers are still being finalized right now.
Let's talk some more about those key demographics. You already mentioned the Latino vote. How about, for instance, suburban women or independents or young voters? You pick one.
I mean, yeah, all three of those categories. Suburban women, particularly white women, still voted along the lines with Trump, and young voters too. There was a surprise among some young voters leaning more right than they may have, at least the Democratic Party may have anticipated. And like I said, going back to a lot of those bellwether towns, Allentown, Reading, like Bucks, Northampton, Lehigh County areas, it was the Latino vote that really surprised a lot of people. The Latino vote in most of those areas in the 222 corridor shifted right.
Let's talk more about young voters. And often a big deal is made out of young people participating in an election. But some of our guests here at PCN have said when it comes down to voting, sometimes they're not that reliable. They don't actually get out there and put the rubber to the road.
Yeah, that's definitely been a concern.
Yeah, I can mention too. I mean, I think what Harrison was saying is right on. Across the board, Trump made inroads in a lot of demographic groups. I would say, again, going back, the biggest demographic group in the U.S. and also just in elections generally, and also the biggest group for Trump is always white voters. So, a lot of hay gets made about, will Trump make inroads with Latinos? Will Trump make inroads with black voters? You saw it much less with black voters. You did absolutely see inroads with Latinos, but they are a far, far smaller share of the population. So when you see these swings toward Trump in Philadelphia, for instance, again, these are like very not official numbers yet. We don't have final counts, but we're on track to see probably the worst performance from a Democrat in maybe 20 years. That's what the Inquirer noted this morning. And so, white voters are the voters among whom Trump does the best. And so you're continuing to see that. You saw Republican voting wards in Philadelphia. Again, they usually tend to be white wards or predominantly white wards, shifting further toward Trump, and some Latino dominated wards also shifting that way. I think at least 2 wards in Philly flipped from Democratic control to Republican control, at least as far as the presidential race goes. So all that to say, I mean, I'm talking a lot about Philly because I think, like everybody on this panel today, I live there. But also, it's just, the fact that Trump made these inroads in the big cities, it means a lot. But also, I think it just is inescapable that it was largely among white voters.
What difference did voter registration efforts make in this election, particularly in Southeast Pennsylvania?
Well, voter registration efforts, I think, of course, were very robust. I think all of us who live in Pennsylvania have noticed that. There's been a lot of door knocking. There's been a lot of text message campaigns. Registration's never an awesome indicator of where the electorate's going to go. It's kind of a lagging, noisy indicator. People register one way and then vote another way all the time. That said, we did see some notable shifts toward Republicans across the state. We saw Democratic registration sort of bottoming out for a lot of this year. And clearly that was in line with what we saw. We saw shifts toward Republicans almost across the board. And just speaking in Pennsylvania, I mean, it wasn't universal. The Lehigh Valley saw a really strong shift toward Republicans. I just mentioned Philadelphia saw some pretty robust shifts. Allegheny County, you saw less of that. They were pretty stable. So it's not happening everywhere. But I would say that, like, yes, turnout trends, it's not as, it doesn't track exactly. You know, if the turnout shifts a certain amount toward Republicans, you're not going to see that exact shift in voting, but it tracked in the same direction.
In which counties statewide did Trump make an especially strong showing?
So like I said, Lehigh Valley, Philadelphia, for sure. Those are the big ones. He did not make as strong of a showing in Allegheny County.
Pat, let's get you involved. I understand that you did a story about Kamala Harris conceding the election. She went and made a speech at her alma mater, Howard University. How did that go? What did she say?
Yeah, I was at Howard for her watch party election night. People were expecting her to speak then. She did not. Obviously, I think the speed of the results was as much a surprise as the who came out on top for that campaign. And so she returned yesterday at 4 p.m. There was not the crowd that there had been election night, but there were a lot of people there. And she delivered a very upbeat speech. She told people, don't despair. This is not a time to throw up your hands. It's a time to roll up your sleeves. She conceded the election, but she said she does not concede the fight for the things that fueled her campaign: democracy, freedom, women's reproductive rights, the dignity of all people. And she also said that she was going to assist with the peaceful transition of power. Now, that's something that we took for granted for most of the history of the United States. And so you couldn't help but see that even as she was saying, I'm going to help Donald Trump, she was kind of taking a backhanded swing at him.
Well, it's interesting to note that as vice president, she still has that duty to perform, Pat, related to the election, and that would be certifying the election that she lost.
Yes, and she'll do it. And she said that is what separates democracy from monarchy or dictatorship, the loyalty to that duty that she will carry out.
Pat and everybody else, what are the prevailing theories as to why voters rejected Kamala Harris?
Oh, there's a lot of theories. Right now, we're sort of in the middle of some finger pointing among operatives for the Harris campaign and local like Democratic organizations, for instance. So part of it is always going to be how was the campaign run on the ground? We've seen that, especially, not to talk too much about it, but in Philly, there have been some public clashes between Bob Brady, who runs the Philadelphia Democratic Party here, and Harris campaign operatives. But I'd say sort of more substantially on things like policy, Harris ran a truncated campaign. Biden dropped out quite late. She didn't have very much time to introduce herself to voters and to lay out a policy message. I think there are absolutely people who have kind of tried to make the case that she could have laid out a more specific policy message, that it wasn't strong enough. I think, it's a little soon to say, honestly, as we're still waiting for final vote counts to say exactly what happened and what went wrong for Democrats. But I also think, this was an unusual election. We had a Democrat running, again, a short campaign. We had a Republican who had previously been president, then had lost an election, then was convicted of some crimes, and then ran again. It's just, there's not an analog to it. And so I think a lot of people did see this. A lot of voters saw this as an election where they wanted to vote on change. They wanted to vote on the economy. And that was a clearly pervasive issue on which voters, for whatever reason, we've talked to many of them and reasons vary, but voters thought that was the issue on which Trump would be stronger.
Katie, as you pointed out, Harris's campaign was relatively short, only about 3.5 months. And one of the messages she tried to deliver, and her with other Democrats as well, tried to warn voters that Donald Trump was an imminent threat to democracy. That's the message we heard over and over. However, was that message received by voters? Anybody can answer.
I would say clearly not among as many voters as it needed to be received by, but I'd be curious to know what others think as well.
Yeah,
I think the whole thing about her, sorry, Harrison, the whole thing about her policies and people didn't get to know her, that's just a false narrative. I think that this was a visceral election. If you were voting on the economy, you'd have to say the economy was in a shambles when Donald Trump left office, and the Biden administration saved it, made the U.S. economy the strongest in the world post-pandemic, lowest unemployment rates in decades, higher wages across the board, a new manufacturing sector that didn't exist before the Biden administration. So, I mean, if you were really looking at, substantive issues, Harris had the advantage. But you just cannot overlook the role of race and gender in her loss.
Harrison, did you have something to say? I don't want to overlook you.
Yeah, I wanted to bounce off points that Katie and Pat made. It was just generally a rough election for incumbents. A lot of people were just fed up with the status quo as it is, regardless of party affiliation. And despite some of those economic indicators may point towards, a lot of people still felt as if they were still living paycheck to paycheck. And in that case, it's whoever happens to be in office at the time that's going to get the detriment of that sentiment.
Pat, I want to go back to the story that you wrote about Kamala Harris making her concession speech. And one of the points that was made in the story was that Democrats are entering a second Trump presidency with no clear leader or plan. So what do they have to do? Do we have any idea?
Well, there are a lot of stars in the Democratic Party. It's one of them will emerge, I'm sure, in the next 4 years. I don't think it will be Kamala Harris. She's now lost. And I think, again, there's a lesson about the country being ready to elect a woman of color. So probably won't be her. But you never know. She's a strong force. But there are, there's Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. There's our own governor, Josh Shapiro. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised to see him make a strong case for himself in 2028.
Let's consider another race that's getting a lot of attention. And in fact, as of this morning, when we're recording this program, the Thursday morning after the election between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick for U.S. Senate is too close to call. So what have you been hearing? Let's start with Katie.
Sure. It was a close election. Casey, I think clearly, as we can see from the returns we have so far, outran Harris. There were some ticket splitters, voters who voted for Trump at the top of the ballot and Casey for Senate. It is within the recount margin. So Pennsylvania does automatic recounts. If you're within, I believe, less than a point or less than half of a point. In any case, it's there. And so the Casey campaign very much is not going to concede, I think, until provisional ballots are counted, frankly. We're waiting on some of those. We're waiting on a bunch of ballots in Cambria County, which had election day issues and is still working to count many of their ballots, 50% of them, as many as that. So that's a pretty heavily Republican county, but it's also a historically sort of labor-aligned blue dog county. So we'll have to see how Casey does there and how McCormick does there. But yeah, on that race, it was an interesting matchup. McCormick is extremely wealthy. He used to run the world's largest hedge fund. He, until pretty recently, lived in Connecticut and still rents a mansion there. Casey is from an extremely old political family in Pennsylvania. His father was a very popular governor. He is extremely closely aligned with Joe Biden. They're both from the Scranton area. So a real meeting of different sections of American politics. And I think absolutely what was happening at the top of the ticket is unavoidable in this race. Trump did have coattails in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. He wasn't just like, he lifted other Republican candidates. It wasn't just that he won for himself. So, it's a fascinating race. We just, as we're taping this, it's not called, but the Republicans feel very confident, I should say.
And considering McCormick is a relative unknown among voters, how did he get himself into a position where he was able to mount such a serious challenge?
Well, money was a big part of it. He has a lot of it. When he first ran for U.S. Senate a couple years ago, he lost in the primary, but only very narrowly against Mehmet Oz. And that got him a foot into Pennsylvania politics, got him the connections that you need to run a serious campaign. And through a combination of, again, he's able to self-fund to some extent, but also he just got a lot of money from Republican insiders. And so that helped him on his way. It was an extremely expensive campaign, I should say. And Casey also raised an enormous amount of money. I think Casey ended up raising more, although there was outside spending that we haven't fully calculated. But yeah, I mean, a lot of money running before, that's kind of how you do it.
Katie, let's talk about another race that you've been covering, and you filed a story about the race for Attorney General, and it looks like we have a tentative winner there, by the way, and that would be Dave Sunday over Eugene DePasquale. You did a story about money flowing into this race from sources outside the candidates, and that's where it gets interesting. Who are they?
Sure, yeah, and I should say, so Sunday definitely is the winner there. DePasquale is conceded. There's really no questions about any of the row office races in Pennsylvania at this point, but yeah. DePasquale got way outspent by two sources that were supporting Sunday. One of them is the Republican Attorneys General Association, RAGA, and the other is Jeff Yass, PAC's, funded almost entirely by Jeff Yass, who is a high-speed trader. He's a Wall Street guy, as well as a very prominent school choice advocate. He's been the money behind the majority, I would say, of serious statewide Republican campaigns in Pennsylvania recently. And so he, in concert with the Sunday campaign, funded a ton of ads. And then the RAGA ads were funded independently. And so I think that really helped Sunday. He was not known statewide, whereas DePasquale had already been elected statewide. And so he needed to really introduce himself to voters.
Now, Katie, I understand why the Attorney General's Association would be interested in a race like this, but this other individual you told us about, say his name again, and what does he get out of supporting this candidate anyway?
Jeff Yass.
Yeah.
And that's a great question. He supports almost exclusively Republican candidates, not always, but school choice. So specifically programs that will take money away from public schools and route them toward initiatives that fund private parochial schools, usually using scholarships or funds that students can use to attend schools they want, or other forms of school choice programs, funding charter schools, for instance. So what does he want? I'm not sure. The Sunday campaign has said that they have no position on school choice, that they, didn't court this, but they accept, support from whoever. And so I think that's one of the things I'm interested in is, does Yass just want Republicans winning statewide in Pennsylvania? Is there something specific he sees as a benefit to having an attorney general who he helped support? I'm not sure.
Katie, as you know, Attorney General can be a springboard to higher office, case in point, Governor Shapiro. So how ambitious is Dave Sunday?
It's a good question for Dave Sunday. He hasn't said that he wants to be the governor or anything. This is his first statewide office, so I guess we'll see.
All right, let's get Harrison involved again. Harrison, I understand you've been following the race for Congress in District 7. That would be Ryan McKenzie versus Susan Wild. She's the incumbent. Looks like McKenzie's the winner. Tell us about that race, Harrison.
Yeah, it does look like McKenzie, who's a state rep now, is kind of riding those coattails of Trump, like Katie mentioned before. And I've been keeping an eye on this as a Bethlehem native too, so my hometown. But Susan Wild made the House in the wave of female lawmakers that took over in 2018, and she was successfully reran quite a few times. But this time, it just seemed like she wasn't able to overcome the shift red in Northampton County. like I mentioned before, it's kind of a swing, like the ultimate bellwether. It's one of those counties that voted for Obama twice, and then Trump in 2016, and then Biden in 2020. Biden won the area just by less than 2,000 votes in 2020. So that kind of flipped in the other direction this time around, with Republicans breaking that 50% majority.
Harrison, when we covered Election Day here at PCN, one of our guests said that sometimes voters just get tired of a certain person being in office, that there's a certain fatigue involved. And that makes me think about Susan Wild, who had held this office before. Was that district due for a change?
Well, the voters seem to think so. And I'll kind of bring that back to the general idea that this was a tough election night for incumbents across the board. It just seems like people are looking for change, regardless of the area and the candidate that was holding the office.
Katie, let's go back to you and consider some other row offices. We talked about Attorney General. How about Treasurer? That's the Stacey Garrity-Aaron McClellan race, and Garrity seems to be the winner there.
Garrity is the winner. Yeah, that was probably the most uneven matchup of the row offices. Aaron McClellan was a little bit of a dark horse candidate. She beat the Democratic endorsed candidate in the primary, and she did not get an endorsement from Josh Shapiro. She was the only row office candidate who had not endorsed him. Shapiro didn't say exactly why, but I think it's notable that McClellan, when Shapiro was in the running for vice president, McClellan very pointedly endorsed someone else to be the vice president. So that's a little bit of, I think, personal politics there. She also did not receive money from him, and she had a very hard time raising money overall. Garrity is an incumbent also. As Harrison said, it was a tough time for many incumbents, but not our two Republican row officers here in Pennsylvania. Garrity won, as well as did Tim DeFore, the Auditor General, who beat Malcolm Kenyatta, the state representative, in a race that I would say was actually the least political of the row office races. DeFore has really tried to stay out of partisan politics in his role. Kenyatta tried to introduce more of these political issues to the race, but again, did not prevail.
Let's turn away from the election, at least for a couple minutes, folks, and consider some other stories that are actually going on while the election goes on. And I'm thinking about the new arena that's being proposed for the 76ers. And Harrison and Pat, I know you've both written about this. Pat, for the out-of-towners, tell us what's at stake there. What's happening with proposing this new arena?
The 76ers don't like being tenants of the Wells Fargo Center. The owner wants his own arena, and he thought it would be good to build it in Center City for a variety of reasons. And it ran into immediate opposition. I mean, like the nanosecond after he proposed it, the neighboring community of Chinatown rose up in opposition before they really even knew what was going to be involved. And they have not let up. Nonetheless, it has support from labor, which is very important politically in Philadelphia, especially for Mayor Parker, who is, attributes a lot of her success in the mayoral election to her endorsement by labor. And she says that she researched it independently and looked at all the pros and cons, and she decided to support it. And so introduced the legislation into city council, and council already passed the first couple sort of preliminary procedural bills to get the ball rolling. And so it is now in city council's hand. There are going to be public hearings beginning next Tuesday. We expect a lot of opposition, but when the Parker administration testifies, we're also going to get a lot of reasons why it would be good for this city to have this.
Whenever a massive structure is about to be put up, Pat, there's usually some controversy amongst the neighbors. So which part of Philadelphia, which neighborhood has a stake in this, and how do they feel about this place going up, if indeed it does?
Well, Chinatown is right next door, and they are the strongest opponents. They generally oppose anything coming into Center City near them. There was a proposal for a stadium years ago. There have been other things, but they have been encroached on nonetheless. They haven't won every fight. The convention center is also their neighbor now. There's a federal correctional center that's also their neighbor now. They don't want an arena, and it's pretty clear that is the consensus view in Chinatown. But there's also, Jefferson Hospital is a bit to the south, and there are concerns among groups in that area. But how will ambulances get through the traffic on a basketball game night or a concert night? And then there's Washington Square West is a kind of a fancy neighborhood, and there's a contingent of neighbors there that just don't want anything that close to them. And then there's the Gayborhood, which is a bit west and south of where the arena would be, but they've also come out against it.
Hey, let's talk about one more story. We have 2 or 3 minutes left, and Harrison, I'm going to pitch it to you. Volodymyr Zelensky visited a munitions plant in Scranton, and what was the purpose of that visit?
Yeah, this was back in September. That plant specifically in Lackawanna County has been providing a lot of munitions to Ukraine in the war against Russia. So that was actually a part of a U.S. tour that Zelensky was doing. He ended up in D.C., talking to politicians there, trying to pitch his case for more support. But it did cause a bit of backlash because it was in the middle of campaign season, and some Republicans saw it as possibly some sort of campaign miscue because he was with some Democratic candidates in Pennsylvania when he visited the plant. And
I understand there was some opposition to his visit because of costs that might have been incurred by having necessary security for Zelensky? Yeah,
there was... They were alleging that it interfered in the election because he was getting a military escort, but that doesn't seem to be much of a scandal because it's not uncommon for foreign officials to receive security in the U.S.
We have about a minute left in our program. Let's just make a big circle back to the election. And Katie, I want you to tell us what kind of impression election 2024 made on you as a reporter. What made it tough? What made it different?
It's a good question. I would say, the biggest impression is just that nothing is ever set in stone. Electorates can change, political coalitions can change at any time, and reporters should always be ready for that to happen.
How about you, Harrison? What did you get out of this election cycle? Try to tell us in just a few seconds.
The third parties came into play, I think, a bit. If you look at the Casey McCormick race, I know it's not decided, but there's a chance the margins might be within the amount of votes that the Green Party candidate got.
And Pat, how about you? You have the last word. What did you get out of this election?
Well, being in Philadelphia felt like being at the epicenter of the universe during this election. Both parties were heavily courting Philadelphia, and it worked for the Republicans.
Our guests have been Pat Loeb from KYW-AM, Katie Meyer from Spotlight, PA, and Harrison Cann from City and State, PA. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.